The silence of a cul-de-sac at 11 o'clock at night is a very specific kind of quiet, because it isn't just the absence of noise, but rather a heavy, expectant stillness that makes you feel like the entire neighborhood is holding its breath. I was sitting in my living room with only a single lamp dimmed low, trying to finish a report for work, when the first sound broke the peace of the evening. It wasn't a car driving by or a dog barking in the distance, but a sharp, rhythmic rapping against the glass of my front door that made me jump so hard my laptop nearly slid off my knees. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in a neighborhood where most people are in bed by 10, a visitor at this hour usually means there is some kind of emergency. I stood up slowly, my joints feeling stiff as I walked toward the hallway, and I peered through the narrow decorative window that runs alongside the door frame. Standing there was a man wearing a bright red thermal vest and a baseball cap pulled down so low that it cast a deep, triangular shadow over his eyes. He was holding a large, grease-stained cardboard box, and he was staring directly at the wood of the door rather than looking around for a doorbell or a light switch. I felt a small wave of relief wash over me, thinking that a neighbor had simply sent a late-night pizza to the wrong house. So I cracked the door just a few inches while keeping the security chain firmly engaged. "I think you have the wrong house, man. I didn't order anything tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice polite but firm so he would understand that I wasn't interested in a long conversation. The man didn't move an inch, and he didn't look up to meet my eyes, but instead, he shifted the weight of the heavy box in his arms and spoke in a voice that was eerily flat and devoid of any emotion. "This is for the funeral," he whispered, and the words felt like a bucket of ice water being poured down my spine because there hasn't been a death in my family or on this street for years. The order was prepaid for a funeral at this address, and the instructions were very clear that I have to see the body before I can leave the delivery on the porch. A cold, prickly sensation crawled up the back of my neck as I realized how insane that sounded, and I began to close the door, telling him again that he was at the wrong location and that he needed to leave immediately before I called the police. But as the door was almost shut, he jammed the toe of a heavy, steel-toed boot into the crack, preventing it from latching, and he finally looked up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed in a terrifying, unblinking stare that made me realize he wasn't just a confused delivery driver, but someone who was deeply unstable or under the influence of something powerful. "Don't be like that," he said, his voice rising slightly in pitch as he pressed his weight against the door, making the security chain groan and rattle against the frame. "The person who paid for this said you would be expecting me, and they said that if you didn't let me in, I should just wait until the lights go out so I can finish the job." I slammed my shoulder against the door with every bit of strength I possessed, managing to shove his foot back just enough to click the deadbolt into place, and I immediately scrambled to the phone on the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled the device, watching it skitter across the tile floor, and as I reached for it, I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal from the front porch. I looked toward the window and saw the man's silhouette moving toward the outdoor light fixture, and with a quick, practiced motion, he unscrewed the bulb until the entire front of my house was plunged into a suffocating, pitch-black darkness. I didn't wait for him to try the door again. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the block and retreated into the mudroom at the back of the house, which connects the kitchen to the sliding glass doors leading to the deck. I was trying to dial emergency services, but the signal was dropping in and out, and all I could hear was the frantic thumping of my own heart echoing in the small, cramped space. I stood there in the dark, my eyes straining to adjust, watching the backyard for any sign of movement through the glass. The cul-de-sac was silent again, but it was a predatory silence now, filled with the knowledge that someone was circling my home like a wolf looking for a gap in the fence. 3 minutes passed in total agony, and I began to wonder if he had actually left, or if he was simply standing on the front lawn watching the house for any sign of life. I took a cautious step toward the living room to check the front window again, but then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry mulch in my flower beds, moving slowly and deliberately around the side of the garage. He was coming toward the back, and I knew that the sliding glass door was the weakest point in the entire house because the latch was old and prone to slipping if enough pressure was applied. I dropped to the floor, crawling behind the kitchen island so I wouldn't be visible from the outside, and I listened as the footsteps moved onto the wooden slats of the deck. The wood creaked under his weight, a slow, rhythmic protest that tracked his movement toward the center of the glass pane. I could see the faint outline of his head through the sheer curtains, a dark shape blocking out the moonlight as he leaned his forehead against the glass to peer inside. "I can see your phone glowing, friend," he whispered, and his voice was so close that it felt like he was standing right next to me in the room. "The funeral can't start until the guest of honor arrives, and I have a very sharp set of tools in this box that I really don't want to have to use on the door." He began to slide the door back and forth, testing the strength of the lock, and I realized with a surge of panic that the vibrations were slowly rattling the loose latch upward. Every time he jolted the door, the metal hook slipped a fraction of an inch higher, and it was only a matter of seconds before he would be able to simply slide the glass open and step into the kitchen. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white, preparing myself to fight for my life, when I remembered the heavy wooden dowel I kept in the track of the door to prevent it from being opened from the outside. I realized with horror that I had taken the dowel out earlier that day to clean the glass and I hadn't put it back yet. It was sitting on the counter, just 5 feet away from me, but reaching for it would mean exposing myself to the man standing on the deck. I took a deep breath, lunging upward to grab the heavy wooden rod, and as I did, our eyes met through the glass for a split second that felt like an eternity. His face twisted into a jagged, horrific grin, and he threw his entire body weight against the door, the latch finally snapping with a sickening crack of breaking metal. The door slid open 6 inches before I could jam the wooden dowel into the track with a desperate, frantic shove, hitting his fingers in the process and making him howl with a mixture of rage and pain. He tried to reach his hand through the gap to grab my arm, but I shoved the kitchen table against the sliding door, pinning it shut and creating a temporary barricade that would buy me at least a few minutes. I ran back into the center of the house, locking myself in the heavy-duty bathroom that had no windows, and I finally managed to get a clear signal to the police dispatcher, shouting my address and the description of the man before I collapsed against the tile floor. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the man pacing around the exterior of the house, his heavy boots thumping against the siding as he looked for another way in. Then, the noise stopped completely, and the silence returned. I stayed perfectly still, my ear pressed against the bathroom door, waiting for the sound of sirens or the shouting of officers, but there was nothing but the sound of the wind. And then, it happened. The last knock. It wasn't on the front door, and it wasn't on the sliding glass in the back. It was a slow, heavy, and incredibly powerful series of 3 knocks on the small, wooden access panel in the ceiling of the bathroom, the one that leads directly into the attic crawlspace. He hadn't been trying to get in through the doors anymore. He had climbed onto the roof using the trellis and had slipped through the attic vent while I was distracted by the barricade. The wood of the panel shifted, a thin line of dust falling onto my shoulder as the man above me began to lift the door. But just as the panel began to slide aside, the neighborhood was suddenly flooded with the blue and red strobe lights of 4 police cruisers pulling into the cul-de-sac at high speed. The man in the attic froze, and I heard him scramble back toward the vent as the officers kicked in my front door and began clearing the rooms with their flashlights. They caught him as he was trying to jump from the roof into the backyard, and they found that the grease-stained box he was carrying wasn't filled with food at all, but with a collection of industrial zip ties, a roll of duct tape, and a set of surgical scalpels. The funeral he was talking about was meant for me, and if the police had arrived even 60 seconds later, he would have been dropping down from that ceiling right on top of me. I moved out of that neighborhood the very next week, but even now, every time I hear a delivery truck drive down my street, I find myself checking the ceiling, waiting for a knock that I pray will never come again. The hum of the city usually feels like a protective layer of white noise when you live on the 24th floor of a modern high-rise, because the height creates a physical distance between you and the chaos of the streets below. I had chosen this apartment specifically for its advanced security features, including a smart lock system that was supposed to be unhackable and a concierge who monitored every single person who entered the lobby. But lately, the technology had been acting strange, and I started receiving automated delivery notifications on my phone for packages I had never ordered. Items like heavy-duty zip ties, blackout curtains, and industrial-strength cleaning supplies. I assumed it was a glitch in the building's database, a simple mix-up of unit numbers, until the knocking started happening with a precision that felt far too intentional to be a mistake. It began on a Tuesday night at exactly 10 p.m., a sharp, rhythmic series of 4 knocks that sounded like someone was using a heavy ring against the metal frame of my door. I walked to the entrance and checked the digital peephole, but the screen only showed an empty, brightly lit hallway that smelled faintly of floor wax and silence. I shrugged it off as a prank by one of the teenagers down the hall, but then it happened again at 11 p.m., and then again at midnight with the same 4 knocks echoing through my living room. Each time I checked the camera, the hallway was deserted, and there was no sound of retreating footsteps or the closing of a distant door. By the 3rd night, the lack of sleep was starting to make the edges of my vision blur, and the sense of security I felt in my expensive sanctuary was beginning to crumble. I was sitting in my kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and staring at the door, when my phone buzzed with another delivery notification that said, "Item delivered to your doorstep," even though I knew no one had come up the elevator. I crept toward the door and looked through the glass lens, and my heart stopped when I saw a small, unmarked box sitting directly in front of my mat. I didn't want to open the door, but curiosity and fear are a dangerous combination, so I slowly disengaged the electronic lock and pulled the door open just wide enough to reach out and grab the package. Inside the box was a single, printed photograph of me sitting at my kitchen island from the night before, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer was standing inside my own living room. My hands began to shake so violently that the photo fluttered to the floor, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the smart lock hadn't been failing. It had been compromised from the very beginning. I rushed to the door to lock it, but as I reached for the handle, the power in the entire apartment suddenly flickered and died, leaving me in a darkness so thick it felt like it had weight. I stood there in the entryway, my breathing shallow and ragged, listening for any sound of movement from within the shadows of my own home. The silence was absolute for several minutes, until the first knock of the night finally arrived, but it didn't come from the hallway outside. It was a soft, muffled thud that came from the inside of my coat closet, which was located only 2 feet away from where I was standing. My blood turned to ice as I realized that the deliver man hadn't been knocking to get in. He had been knocking to see if I was still paying attention while he was already hiding inside. I didn't stay to investigate, and I didn't try to turn on the lights. I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to get out into the hallway where there were cameras and neighbors who might hear me scream. But the smart lock, now devoid of power and likely tampered with by whatever device the intruder was using, refused to budge, the manual override handle spinning uselessly in my hand. I was trapped in a high-tech cage with someone who had been watching me for weeks, someone who knew my schedule, my habits, and exactly how I looked when I was most vulnerable. I retreated into the living room, tripping over the coffee table in the dark, and I grabbed a heavy decorative statue from the shelf to use as a weapon. I could hear the closet door creaking open, a slow, agonizing sound of hinges that haven't been oiled, followed by the soft sound of boots stepping onto the hardwood floor. The intruder didn't say a word, and he didn't turn on a flashlight. He just walked with a terrifying confidence through the space, moving toward the kitchen where he knew I would likely be hiding. "I know you're tired," a voice whispered from the darkness, sounding calm and disturbingly familiar, like someone I might have passed in the lobby 100 times without ever really seeing. "The debt is finally due, and I've come to collect the life you think you own so securely behind these glass walls." I realized then that he wasn't a stranger, but the night concierge who had been monitoring my safety for the last 6 months, the man who had access to every keycard and every security code in the building. He had used his position to learn the layout of my apartment and the flaws in the digital system, and now he was moving toward me with a length of the industrial zip ties I had seen in the delivery notifications. I scrambled toward the balcony door, thinking that I could scream for help from the railing, but as I slid the glass open, the wind from the 24th floor rushed in, drowning out any sound I could hope to make. He was closing the distance now, his silhouette blocked out against the faint light of the city skyline, and I knew that if I stayed in the living room, I wouldn't stand a chance against his size and strength. I waited until he was just a few feet away, Then I threw the heavy statue with everything I had, hearing it thud against his chest and cause him to stumble back into the kitchen island. I didn't wait to see if he was hurt. I ran toward the bedroom, slamming the door and shoving my heavy oak dresser against it, knowing it would only buy me a few moments of life. I crawled under the bed, clutching my phone and finally seeing a single bar of signal appear as I dialed the emergency number, whispering my address and the name of the concierge to the operator. I could hear him throwing his shoulder against the bedroom door, the wood splintering under the force of his rage, and I knew the dresser was starting to slide across the floor. He was laughing now, a low, guttural sound that made me want to vanish into the floorboards, and I closed my eyes, praying that the police were already in the elevator. The crashing at the door suddenly stopped, and for a moment, I thought he had given up or was looking for a tool to break through the wood. I stayed perfectly still, my chest heaving as I tried to stay silent, listening to the heavy silence of the apartment return once again. And then, it happened, the last knock. It was 3 slow, deliberate taps against the side of the bed frame, coming from the space directly beneath me where I was hiding. He hadn't been trying to get through the bedroom door at all. He had circled back through the master bathroom's connecting vent and was already under the bed with me. I screamed and rolled out from under the bed just as a hand reached out to grab my ankle, and I scrambled toward the window, prepared to break the glass if I had to. But at that exact second, the bedroom door was blown off its hinges as the building's tactical security team and the police swarmed into the room with their weapons drawn. They dragged the man out from under the bed, finding a master keycard and a map of every unit in the building in his pocket, proving that I wasn't his first target, just the only one who had survived long enough to call for help. I moved out of the city that night and never looked back at a high-rise again, because now I know that no matter how many locks you have or how high you live, the person who holds the keys is the one you should fear the most. And even now, when I stay in a hotel or a new apartment, I spend the first hour checking every closet and every vent, because I know that the most dangerous knock is the one that comes from inside the room. The neon sign above the gas station hums with a persistent, buzzing vibration that usually keeps me company during the long hours of the graveyard shift. But tonight, the sound felt more like a warning than a comfort. I work at a station that sits on a lonely stretch of Highway 52, a road that mostly serves long-haul truckers and people who are trying to get somewhere else as quickly as possible without being noticed. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the world outside the plate glass windows is nothing but a vast, ink-black void, and the fluorescent lights of the shop make the interior feel like a brightly lit stage where I am the only performer. I was counting the till and preparing the morning coffee when a beat-up, charcoal-colored sedan pulled up to the pump, but the driver didn't get out to pump gas or even turn off the headlights. I watched from behind the counter, my hand hovering over the silent alarm button, as the car sat there for 5 minutes with the engine idling and the high beams cutting through the darkness like 2 accusing eyes. Finally, the door creaked open and a man stepped out, but he wasn't wearing a coat despite the biting autumn chill, and his movements were stiff, almost as if he were being controlled by invisible wires. He didn't walk toward the pumps. He walked directly to the front door, his eyes fixed on me with a vacant, unblinking intensity that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. He entered the store, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt completely wrong for the energy he brought into the room. He didn't buy anything, and he didn't ask for directions. He simply walked to the back of the store, picked up a heavy, black plastic bag from the trash bin, and set it down on the counter in front of me before turning around and walking back out into the night. I stood there for a second, my heart thumping against my ribs, wondering if I should call the manager, or if I was just overreacting to a strange customer in a lonely place. I reached for the bag, expecting it to be heavy or dangerous, but it was surprisingly light, containing nothing but a single old-fashioned alarm clock that was ticking loudly in the sudden silence of the shop. As I looked at the clock, I realized the time on the face was set exactly 10 minutes ahead of the actual time, and the ticking seemed to be getting faster with every passing second. I looked back out the window to see where the man had gone, but the sedan was still idling at the pump, and the driver's side door was standing wide open. The man wasn't in the car, and he wasn't at the pumps. He was standing just outside the glass, his face pressed against the window so hard that his skin was turning a ghostly, bloodless white. He began to knock on the glass, a slow and deliberate sound that echoed through the empty store like the beating of a giant heart. It wasn't a frantic let me in kind of knock, but a rhythmic, taunting tap that suggested he was simply waiting for the clock on my counter to reach its final destination. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the line was dead, and the cellular signal, which is always spotty out here, had dropped to 0 bars as if someone had activated a jammer nearby. The man outside began to move along the perimeter of the building, his knuckles never leaving the glass as he circled the store, the knocking sound moving from the front window to the side, and then toward the back where the storage room is located. I realized I couldn't stay in the main area where the windows made me an easy target, so I retreated toward the walk-in freezer, thinking the thick, insulated steel doors would provide me with a fortress until the sun came up. I stepped inside the freezer, the blast of sub-zero air hitting my face and making me gasp, and I pulled the heavy handle shut, listening to the satisfying click of the industrial latch. I sat down on a crate of frozen milk, clutching a heavy metal tire iron I had grabbed from the back shelf, and I tried to slow my breathing so I could hear what was happening on the other side of the wall. The knocking had stopped, and the only sound was the mechanical drone of the cooling fans and the distant, muffled hum of the man's idling car engine outside. I waited for what felt like hours, my fingers growing numb from the cold, watching the minutes tick by on my own watch as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The fear started to subside, and I began to convince myself that the man had probably seen the morning light and fled before any commuters could arrive to find him. I stood up, my joints aching from the freezing temperatures, and I reached for the internal release handle to exit the freezer and call for help from the office landline. I was just about to push the lever when I heard a sound that made my entire body go limp with a paralyzing, soul-crushing terror. It was the last knock. It didn't come from the glass windows of the storefront, and it didn't come from the heavy steel door in front of me. It came from inside the walk-in freezer, from the very back where the boxes of ice are stacked floor to ceiling. A slow, rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the metal interior wall, followed by the sound of a heavy plastic bag being dragged across the floor behind me. I didn't turn around. I threw my entire weight against the exit lever and burst out into the storage room, sprinting through the shop and out the front door without looking back once. I ran until I reached the highway and flagged down a passing trucker, who saw my state of pure panic and immediately called the authorities on his radio. When the police arrived, they found the charcoal sedan abandoned at the pump, but the car was empty, and the engine had finally sputtered out after running out of fuel. Inside the freezer, they found the black plastic bag I had seen earlier, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with a collection of Polaroid photos of me, taken over the last 3 weeks during my shifts, showing that the man hadn't just appeared that night. He had been living in the crawl space above the freezer for nearly a month, watching me through the vents and waiting for the perfect moment to announce his presence. I quit that job the same morning and moved to a city where the lights never go out and the buildings are never empty, because I realized that the most dangerous thing about a lonely road isn't the silence, but the things that hide within it. And sometimes the person you think is knocking to get in is actually knocking to let you know they are already there.